Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to ASA's Travel Tuesday. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing Dr. Heather Sebo giving us a talk about the labyrinth and the dancing floor, Homer's Mythic Crete. Heather did a PhD in classics, specialising in Greek myth and drama at the University of Melbourne. She is the Honorary Associate in Classics at La Trobe University. She is also, intriguingly, a performance consultant in ancient drama at the Complete Works Theatre Company. Heather is leading a wonderful tour next year between sea and sky, Homer's Greek islands, and that is going to be in October 2024. And I believe there are still some places available, so it does sound a very tempting tour indeed. So please welcome Dr. Heather Sebo for her talk on Homer's Mythic Crete. Thank you very much, Heather.
Thank you, Susanna. It's a pleasure to be part of the Travel Tuesday series, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk about the Homer tour and about the places we visit, and especially about the ideas on which it's based. As far as I'm aware, ours is the only dedicated Homer tour on the internet, but from time to time groups do attempt to follow Odysseus in his 10 years of fantastical wanderings, and these tours are looking for strange lands inhabited by giants and cyclops and sirens and seductive enchantresses. But the thing that makes our tour unique and entirely different is that we go to the real places that Homer names, the places that he will have visited and the places that he will have heard about since his early childhood. So I don't say Homer's poems are history, and I don't say that they can give us accurate dating or that they can tell us everything we need to know for understanding what we see on our tour. But I do say that the Homeric poems are the closest we can come to an eyewitness experience of the ambience, the customs, and the artifacts of the deep Aegean past. In this talk, I'll try to demonstrate some of the ways in which Homer can be our guide. The scholarly consensus is that Homer lived sometime in the late 700s BCE, or BC, I prefer BCE, and that his poems were written down either in his lifetime or soon after, thanks to the newly minted Greek alphabet. But the Iliad and the Odyssey did not begin as written texts. Homer was an oral poet. If the poems were written down in his lifetime, they would have been dictated to a scribe. He, if he was a he, was one of the many generations of singer poets who made a living travelling around the ancient Mediterranean world, performing material drawn from a vast epic story tradition. Over the centuries, empires rose and fell, cities burned, and writing systems disappeared. But the loss of writing didn't matter to the oral poets, who continued as they always had, learning from each other, preserving the refinements of the masters who had gone before, developing and honing their own special craft of composition in performance. Yes, that's what I said. Composition in performance, right there in front of an audience. The techniques they used to accomplish this remarkable feat is a subject in itself. So while Homer's poems will inevitably reflect the attitudes and the conditions of life in his own world of early Iron Age Greece, they are the result of an essentially accumulative process that ends up preserving all manner of bits and pieces. I really want to emphasize that. It's like insects and flowers caught in amber, caught in the memory of these oral poets, the memory that stretches back through all the poets who've sung before them. The poems are an amalgam of elements from all the centuries during which the epic tradition flourished. Language forms and descriptions of objects that had disappeared from common use become embedded in the narratives and were passed down over the generations. Eminent Homerist Martin West remarks that certain features of the epic language belong to an earlier stage of Greek than the language of the Linear B tablets. And this is what the Linear B tablets look like. And we're going to hear a lot more about them. Now, given that these tablets date from about 1450 to 1300 BCE, West is saying that Homer was using language forms that were current at least 700 years before he lived. It's also the case that Homer describes objects that were buried hundreds of years before his lifetime and are now in museums after having been dug up by modern archaeologists. An example of an object that Homer can describe accurately but would have never seen is the boar's tooth style of warrior helmet. Boar's tooth helmets appear on the Akrotiri friezes that were buried by a volcanic eruption in about 1600 BC. We're talking about a long time ago. And they are in museums. These helmets are in museums throughout Greece. And we see one of these in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum. They were passed down as heirlooms. But on the basis of the archaeology, we can say that these helmets had completely disappeared from use and disappeared from the world about 400 years before Homer's time. The helmets in the Iliad, in Homer's poem, the Iliad, are overwhelmingly made of bronze, like the helmet on the right. You can see it, it's a bronze helmet. The helmets on the left are the boar's tooth helmets that I'm talking about, I particularly want to talk about. As I say, the helmets in the Iliad are overwhelmingly made of bronze, but on one occasion on a night raid, Odysseus was given a boar's tooth helmet by the Cretan warrior Meriones. The text is on the slide. When I read it, you can compare it with the images. Meriones put over Odysseus's head a helmet. On the inside, it was held together with leather thongs, and on the outer side, the white teeth of a boar with shining tusks were close sewn with craftsmanship and skill. It was lined with felt. Now, Homer had never seen this kind of helmet, but he can describe it because the description has come down in the tradition. Martin West, that scholar that I cited before, he's a very eminent Homer scholar and a rather conventional one, which is why I like to cite him, because he's very good evidence for a fairly radical point of view, which some of the things I'm saying will be. So Martin West comments that Meriones seems to be a genuine Minoan from the heyday of Knossos, and that Odysseus himself appears to be an early figure, especially associated with Crete. So Martin West is saying here, just before he said that the language that Homer's using, parts of the language that Homer's using are 700 years earlier than his own lifetime, and now he's saying that his characters also come from a much earlier time in the world, and indeed the Bronze Age world, than the time in which Homer lived. Homer lived in the Iron Age. In the Odyssey, Odysseus acquires a distinctive scar just above his knee in a coming-of-age boar's hunt on Mount Parnassus with his maternal uncles. His uncles bandage the wound and sing magical incantations over it. And again, we know that this kind of treatment of wounds is Mycenaean rather than from Homer's own particular period. So our tour is a prodigious journey. We begin in Hania on Crete and travel across the island to the major archaeological sites of Elefthana, Knossos and Phaistos. We also hope to visit Zominthos on Mount Ida, a new excavation that's not yet open to the public. We fly to the mainland, as you can see the cursor doing, and in our new 2024 itinerary, we will more or less circumnavigate the Peloponnese before we cross the deep blue Ionian Sea to the islands of Kephallonia and Ithaca. Next, we return to the mainland and travel north to the ancient oracle at Dodona. We picnic on the banks of the underworld Acheron River, and finally end our tour on the cosmopolitan island of Corfu. It's a prodigious tour all the way from the south, from Crete all the way almost to the Albanian border. Now, I've just said that Homeric poetry preserves nuggets from the deep past. And it's obvious that that will be useful for us travelling around the very ancient sites that we visit. But Homeric poetry has also had such a formative and such a continuous influence that we often meet echoes of it in the later Greek world. And for example, we can recognise Homer's great god Zeus in the 13th century Byzantine conception of Christ Pantocrator, the all-powerful ruler of the world, in the dome of this church, the Church of the Virgin of Swift Consolation, Arta, in northern Greece. In the Iliad, Homer's Zeus says, look at the image when I read this, "Nothing I do shall be vain, nor revocable, nor unfulfilled when I bend my head in assent to it." He spoke and inclined his head with its dark brows, and the immortally anointed hair of the great god swept from his divine head, and all Olympus was shaken. Well, on our tour, we visit some of the great sanctuaries of Zeus. We visit many archaeological sites, but among them, some of the great sanctuaries of Zeus. For example, Olympia, already a site of Zeus's worship in 900 BCE. The contests that are the basis of our modern Olympics were established in 776 BCE, close to Homer's lifetime. The games were held every 4 years for almost 12 centuries. Every day, for almost all that time, Zeus was offered burnt sacrifice using the wood of specially cultivated white poplar trees. Victorious states made lavish dedications to celebrate victory in war, and Olympia became one of the richest sanctuaries in Greece. The elegant circular pholos you are looking at was built by Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. It was recently restored using original columns and other elements returned from Berlin in time for the 2004 Athenian Olympics. The oracle at Dodona in northern Greece is another of Zeus's sanctuaries. Dodona is not well known, but was older even than Apollo's oracle at Delphi. Homer tells us that the barefoot priests interpreted Zeus's prophecies in the sounds of the rustling leaves of the sacred oak. In the Iliad, Achilles prays to Zeus at Dodona. In the Odyssey, the disguised Odysseus claims to have consulted at Dodona about whether to return home to Ithaca openly or in secret. We don't know if he actually went to Dodona or whether it was just one of his famous cover stories, but Odysseus does return in secret, and at the instruction of the goddess Athena, hides the treasure that he has brought back from his wanderings in a sea cave. Later, in the company of one of his own loyal herdsmen, who has no idea who he is, Odysseus returns to the home he has not seen for 20 years to find out what has been going on. We too make that journey up Homer's leaf-trembling Mount Neritos. I especially love this photo, which shows our walk down from the village of Exogy to the ruins of a 2- or 3-story complex that matches Homer's description of Odysseus's home. Odysseus's home, his citadel, has all the aspects of a Bronze Age stronghold. It's an ideal lookout with sight lines to 2 harbours, proximity to a 3rd, and a command of the surrounding fertile land. It also had an excellent water supply that was secured by a vaulted cistern with a confirmed date, an absolute date of 1200 BCE, and the cistern there on Ithaca is exactly like the one we see at Mycenae. A little further down the mountain, we come to the Melanandros Spring, the Blackwater Spring, a lush place that is of special interest because in 20 of the Odyssey, the maidservants are sent to fill vessels at the Blackwater Spring. On one memorable visit, as we emerged from the foliage, a startled farmer called out to us that we had just risen up from the earth. Well, it was a more appropriate greeting than he knew, because one of our next destinations was the Acheron, the underworld river where Odysseus actually summoned and spoke to the souls of the dead. Odysseus's hidden treasure became significant in the 1930s when a collection of bronze cauldrons was found in a sea cave at Pylos Bay in northern Ithaca. They were discovered in a difficult excavation conducted by the redoubtable Sylvia Benton from the British School at Athens. Now, the cave has since collapsed and the bronze is badly deteriorated from the salt water, but we do get to see what remains. And the pictures on the screen are the very best I could do. They are pictures from the actual excavation. You get some idea of the difficulty of that excavation. They were pumping out water and constantly needing to shore up the walls of the cave. It was very precarious. But they found these cauldrons, and these cauldrons predate Homer. And they open up the possibility that a story about 13 tripod bronze cauldrons hidden in a sea cave on Ithaca was told before the Odyssey was even composed. So Odysseus hides his bronze cauldrons. Guess what? 13 cauldrons are found, but the cauldrons are earlier. They date to earlier than the Odyssey. So now, can I give you an idea of the relation in time between Homer and some of the major events in the Cretan Bronze Age civilization? You can see I've put Homer right at the end of the Bronze Age to Iron Age timeline, and I've put the poet Hesiod there as well because I will mention him, and just a tiny bit further on Herodotus because I'll mention his name as well. Now, in about 300 BCE, the Minoans formed the first advanced civilization of Europe on the island of Crete. And we're talking about 3000 BCE, so we're talking at the opposite end of the timeline. So Arthur Evans gave them the name Minoans after Homer's mythic king, King Minos. But it seems the ancient Egyptians called the Minoans the Keftiu. The Minoans were renowned as shipbuilders and sailors. They were in love with the sea. No civilization has so passionately celebrated the strange beauty and diversity of marine life as they did. They also depended on it for food and trade. From as early as 2000 BC, their wonderfully free and expressive art and artifacts were appearing as far afield as Egypt and Syria. You can see that on the timeline too. But by about 1900, sophisticated Minoan palatial complexes begin to appear on Crete. Also, two Minoan writing systems, the so-called Linear A and the Cretan hieroglyphic. Neither of these have been deciphered. The complex at Knossos, I've been talking about palatial complexes appearing all over Crete, but it's the complex at Knossos that is the most famous of the so-called palatial complexes or palaces. And like other such centres, it suffered earthquake damage and was rebuilt and altered around 1700 BC. And you see that right in the middle of the timeline. And this rebuild is what we visit, what we see today, and what Arthur Evans restored to some extent. Now, this date of about 1700 BC, marks the beginning of a remarkable high point of Minoan culture. It seems that from this time on, Crete became increasingly centralised under Knossos. But in the meantime, while all of these things were happening on Crete and Knossos was growing into power and strength, the civilization we call Mycenaean was developing on the Greek mainland. You see that's on the bottom part of the timeline. I've just got some dates for the Mycenaean civilization, which overlaps with the Minoans. The Mycenaeans overlap with the Minoans. The name Mycenaean refers to the fortified citadel of Mycenae in the Peloponnese. Homer's Agamemnon, who launched the 1,000 ships to retrieve Helen from Troy, was king of Mycenae. And by the way, in Homer, it was 1,856 ships that lay siege to Troy. The Mycenaeans were more belligerent and far less artistically brilliant than the Minoans, but they treasured Minoan objects. They employed their skilled artisans and copied their art. This contact that the Mycenaeans had with the Minoans was the impetus for the development of their own culture, and ultimately the Mycenaeans colonized Knossos around 1450 BCE. So you see that too, and that's the period that we call post-palatial. So at that time, centres all over Crete were destroyed and abandoned apart from Knossos. But as very exciting new archaeology has confirmed, the palace at Kydonia at modern Hania also continued to function. So 1400 BCE, there is destruction right across Crete, but Knossos continues to function. Kydonia, that is Hania, continues to function. And there's a period now of a kind of hybrid Minoan Mycenaean culture on Crete. In the past, it was thought that this destruction that I'm talking about, this destruction that happened across Crete in 1450, was caused by the Mycenaean invasion. And that was compounded by severe earthquake activity. And you can see I've put a few earthquake symbols on this timeline just to give you a sense of this constant threat of earthquake in this very geologically unstable part of the world. And no doubt there are more than I have there on the timeline. So that's always an issue in Crete. But in the past, it was also thought that the destruction across Crete was principally caused by the Mycenaeans. But now the picture is becoming more complex because skeletal analysis from the elite graves that have been excavated has shown that the new Cnossian warrior elite did not come from the Mycenaean mainland. They were locals. It seems that the Mycenaean invaders were abetted by a local uprising. So that just gives a very interesting picture. That whole picture is being examined as I speak almost. It's not quite clear what happened, but it seems as though there was some kind of local uprising, some kind of local coup, and that joined with the Mycenaeans. But anyway, from that time on, Crete is governed by a hybrid Mycenaean-Minoan group. Now, around 1300, there was a massive collapse and a total devastation at Knossos. So that Minoan Mycenaean hybrid civilization only lasted for about 150 years, and after that there was collapse at Knossos. The palace was consumed in a fire that baked the tablets and the clay ceilings, all the clay seals that were used as part of the administration, preserving them for us, even as they were buried in the rubble of the collapsing upper stories. As archaeologist Jan Driessen has written, clay tablets need a fire catastrophe to be preserved. So that really was then the end of the Minoan civilization. But the Mycenaean civilization continued, and the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland reached their height 100 years after this, in about 1200 BCE. But the Mycenaean glory days didn't last very long. Ultimately, the whole Bronze Age world was destroyed in a cataclysmic conjunction of disasters. You can see I've marked the Bronze Age collapse with fire emojis on the timeline. But I'll show you a picture now that will give you a better sense of it. In his very well-regarded book, Eric Klein has given the date for the ultimate Bronze Age collapse at about 1100 BCE. And the map will give you an idea of the magnitude of the catastrophe. Cities all over Greece and the Middle East were destroyed, and the Mycenaean civilization disappeared. People at that time must have thought it was the end of everything. But already by 900 BCE, so only 200 years later, there was a kind of a recouping. A completely different Iron Age culture started to emerge, and that would ultimately be our ancient Greece and the Greek miracle. So a new world started to take shape only 200 years after this collapse, and you can see everywhere I've put a fire emoji. It shows a city burnt or was destroyed completely in one way or another. You can see the extent of it on the slide. So I could talk about the new Iron Age world, but as I promised in the title to this talk, let's stay in Crete and the Bronze Age Minoan Mycenaean world, and let's see what Homer can tell us. So here's how Odysseus describes Crete. Homer's Odysseus describes Crete in the Odyssey. There is a fair and fruitful island in mid-ocean called Crete, with many peoples, too many to count, and 90 cities. Languages mixed together there. There is a great city called Knossos, the place where Minos reigned and every 9 years conversed with great Zeus. But it was Homer's near contemporary, the poet Hesiod, and I showed you him on the timeline, he's just about the same dates as Homer, who said that the god Zeus was born on Crete in a cave on Mount Ida, which is modern Mount Silurites in modern-day Crete. So that's what Hesiod says. Hesiod says Zeus was born on Crete, but in Homer, Zeus comes to Crete while pursuing his love affair with the Phoenician princess Europa. You'll know this story. Zeus reminisces about it in the Iliad. But Hesiod tells the famous story that Zeus was consumed with such irresistible desire for Europa that he took on the form of a beautiful white bull, approached her in a flowery meadow, breathing intoxication, saffron, and erotic enchantment. And when the enthralled maiden climbs onto his back, he plunges into the sea and swims to Crete, where he mates with her and produces 2 sons, Minos and Rhadamanthus. So between them, Homer and Hesiod have given us quite a comprehensive idea of Zeus's relation to Crete. As I say, in Homer, Zeus reminiscences about the love affair, but Hesiod actually gives us the details of that love affair. Well, in myth and in Homer, Minos was king of Knossos, and the quote on the slide suggests that he was required to give Zeus an account of his rule every 9 years. The philosopher Plato understood Homer to mean that every 9th year, Minos went to the cave on Mount Ida where Zeus was born and brought back laws for the people. Now, there are conflicting pictures of Minos in the tradition, and that's typical of myth traditions. They often conflict. There are conflicting pictures of Minos even in Homer. But Plato's view of Minos as a just and wise king is consistent with Odysseus' description of him holding the golden scepter of kingship and issuing judgments among the dead, who all around the great Lord argued their cases. Now, I want to emphasize that Minos is not assigning punishment. This is not judging the virtue or the sins of people. He is arbitrating disputes that were not resolved in life. And I find that an arresting insight into human character, that grievances between individuals continue even in the afterlife. Now, I've spoken to you about Minos. Homer also tells us that Minos' brother Rhadamanthus was granted a different fate after death. He was given the blessing of an eternity in the Elysian fields at the end of the earth, where there is neither rain nor snow, and the gentle west wind Zephyrus sends refreshing spring breezes. We don't know why Rhadamanthus was singled out for this wonderful felicity, but he was. Odysseus also says that he saw Minos' daughter Ariadne in the underworld, and I'll tell you a lot more about her in a minute. Now, on the slide, at the top of the slide there, you see the master impression. It's actually, we haven't got the stamp, but we've got the impression in clay, recently found at Hania, showing a young male figure holding a scepter or spear. I put it there because it seems like it may be an image of a Minoan authority figure, but I should hasten to say that in Minoan art there are plenty of female authority figures as well. We don't know how Minoan society functioned, who the leading figures were, or even whether authority was vested in a single individual. But there must have been a very effective administration to build and manage the palatial complexes at Knossos and elsewhere. These centres were, among other things, a storehouse, an arts and crafts workshop, a religious sanctuary, an administrative hub, a ritual and performance space. These multi-floor buildings, and you can just see Arthur Evans's reconstruction of the entrance to Knossos there on the slide. These multi-floor buildings, 15 stories high in places, with their tapered columns, they're finely coloured, they're finely cut, coloured, crystalline masonry and fresco paintings, would have been a wonderful sight. There were amazing buildings elsewhere, but nothing like this in the world before. One especially dramatic architectural innovation is the pier and door partition system. You can see how it works on the slide. The piers carry sets of double doors that fold back into shallow recesses and can be opened or closed in various configurations that allow manipulation of light, movement, and ventilation in the rooms. In addition, new research has shown that selenite slabs from a local quarry were used to line interior as well as exterior walls at Knossos. The crystals in selenite gypsum have wonderful light reflecting qualities and would have made the structure shine and sparkle. To give you some idea of the effect that could be achieved with this gypsum, here is a tabletop, a selenite gypsum tabletop I recently saw advertised online. Unfortunately, these manipulations of light have been lost in Arthur Evans's restorations in concrete. The Greek Archaeological Service is trying to do what they can to restore the gypsum facade. Now, I think, given that these palaces were full of light and the Minoans were so aware of light, I think Homer's description of King Alcinous's Golden Age palace in the Odyssey is drawing on a deep memory of the luminosity of these Minoan buildings. He says, "For as from the sun the light goes, or from the moon, such was the glory on the high-roofed house of great-hearted Alcinous." It's a wonderful memory of this beautiful, illuminated, luminous building, and I think somehow it's come down through 1,000 years of tradition. And there are other intriguing details that connect Homer's Golden Age Phaeacian people to the Minoans. The island of Phaeacian is called Scheria, and this is Odysseus's final destination, and it is their superb seamanship that's able to carry him from the tremendum of his wandering, his fantastical wandering, back to the real world of Ithaca. And in order to assure Odysseus that his sailors are entirely capable of making this sea journey, King Alcinous says that they once conveyed Knossos' brother Rhamanthus, you remember him, all the way to Euboea and back in a single day. If Rhadamanthus travelled from Elysium at the ends of the earth to the real world of central Greece and back again, it certainly was a marvellous journey. Odysseus' sea journey from myth into history and Iron Age Ithaca was similarly a marvellous transit between realms. As the Phaeacian ship speeds, swift as thought, Odysseus sleeps. There is no other way to make this crossing, this night sea crossing. The ship ran on very steady, never wavering. Even the hawk that flies lightest of winged creatures could not have paced her, so easily did she cut through the sea's waves. All such voyages end at the rising of the sun, and so it is that they reach Ithaca at dawn. The Phaeacians lift the sleeping Odysseus onto the beach. They pile up their gifts of 13 tripod cauldrons, remember those 13 tripod cauldrons, beside him, and they turn back to their world. And now the portal has closed forever. Odysseus can never return to Scheria, and nor will the world ever be the same for the Phaeacians, who have incurred the sea god Poseidon's enmity for their part in Odysseus' homecoming. As their ship re-enters the harbour, Poseidon stuns her to stone and roots her to the seabed with a stroke of his hand. Zeus only narrowly dissuades him from burying their city under a mountain. Now, in modern Greece, the people of Corfu say that their island is Golden Age Scheria, and they identify two large sea-girt rocks as the petrified Phaeacian ship. And on the slide, you can see one of these rocks off the coast of Paleokastritsa. There's another one as well on the Canoni Peninsula. For myself, as I said before, I think that the magical people of Scheria, close to the gods and the beginning of time, now lost forever, is a collective memory of the Minoans, the great sailors of the ancient world. The Phaeacians all have nautical names, and like the wasp-waisted Minoans, they are great dancers, tumblers, and acrobats. Which brings me back to Ariadne. Homer knows her not as a divinity, but as a mortal heroine. As I said, Odysseus calls her Minos' daughter and sees her among the dead in the underworld. But for the Minoans, Ariadne was not a name, but a divine title meaning the Holy One. Linguists tell us that DN combination in Ariadne is typical of Minoan words. For the Minoans, she would have been Goddess Ariadne or Potnia Ariadne, Most Holy Mistress. But after the Mycenaean colonization of Crete, this preeminence was diminished, and it was diminished further as time went on. Nevertheless, we have evidence of Ariadne's earlier importance for the Minoans in an intriguing Iliad passage. The passage describes in detail the marvellous shield made for Achilles, the warrior Achilles at Troy, by the god Hephaestus. The shield is covered in images that represent the entire human and physical universe. It shows the heavenly bodies, a city at war and one at peace, scenes of ploughing and harvest, pastures and vineyards, cattle, sheep, and wild animals. Homerist Gregory Nage says that from a mythic point of view, the shield is the ultimate masterpiece of visual art. But one image in particular is extraordinary, and the text is on the screen. Now the renowned smith of the strong arms, Hephaestus, brought all his art to bear in making a dancing floor, like that which once in the wide spaces of Knossos, Daedalus built for Ariadne of the lovely hair. And there were young men on it, and young girls sought for their beauty with gifts of oxen, dancing and holding hands at the wrist. Daedalus is the archetypal mythic artificer, an artisan, architect, artist, and inventor of such skill and ingenuity that here in Homer, even the god Hephaestus pays him the compliment of reproducing his creation, the dancing floor he built for Ariadne at Knossos. Is there any other example in religion or literature of a god copying a human creation? It's equally remarkable that Knossos is the only identifiable place represented on the shield, and Ariadne is the only named human figures. As was the case with the boar's tooth helmets, the memory of Knossos, the names Ariadne and Daedalus and their dancing floor have been preserved in the amber of the oral tradition, and the poet Homer has felt compelled to in his definitive picture of the world, and in so doing, he gives us a rare glimpse into Bronze Age Knossos and into Ariadne's Minoan divinity. So can we decide on a location for Ariadne's dancing floor? Well, here is Knossos as we see it today. When the palace was rebuilt in 1700 BC, remember I said that was the high point, the central court was paved and it could have functioned as a grand performance space. And I'm just putting another slide in so you can see it. Looking from above, you can see that central court. And that could be Ariadne's dancing floor. But the dancing floor might have been the theatral area. You can see it to the north, where we still see rows of seats for spectators. Arthur Evans thought that that was the dancing floor, and he arranged dancers there. But Professor Louise Hitchcock thinks it was here, on the western court, near to the agricultural stores and where harvest festivals would have been celebrated. So far, we don't know. But to have such questions in mind when we explore a site like Knossos makes it easier to think about and far more accessible. So now, what about the labyrinth? Well, let's start with the present and work backwards. Earlier this year, the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford presented a major exhibition called Myths of the Labyrinth. It focused on the tale of the Minotaur, the monstrous man-bull imprisoned in what we call a labyrinth, a dark, disorienting, inescapable maze of passages and blind alleys designed and built by Daedalus at Knossos. The famous story, I think most of you will know it, the famous story is that the Athenian hero Theseus killed the Minotaur and was able to escape from the labyrinth because Ariadne, Minos' daughter, fell in love with him and gave him a ball of thread to mark his route and thus find his way back to the entrance. Theseus and Ariadne sail away together, but he abandons her on the island of Naxos. In some versions, she kills herself or is killed. But the version that became canonical is that the god Dionysus finds her and makes her his immortal bride. Now, in the modern world, the idea of finding one's way through a confounding labyrinth has been applied in many ways to many areas of experience. For example, the labyrinth can express the difficult path to spiritual enlightenment or to self-knowledge, or it can be an image of the complexity of our unconscious psyche. But the word didn't have anything like these meanings for the Minoans and Mycenaeans, and this word is not found in Homer. Indeed, the earliest use of the word labyrinth that approaches our meaning is not until the 5th century BCE in the Greek historian Herodotus. And you remember I had him right at the end of the timeline. That's 1,000 years after Knossos and the Minoans. So is the Minotaur in the labyrinth really a late Greco-Roman story and anachronistically set at Knossos? Now, this is a highly controversial subject, and the evidence I'll be citing is circumstantial. But I think, although it is changed almost beyond recognition, there is genuine Bronze Age matter in the myth. And although it took over 1,000 years for the story we know finally to take shape, all the elements were in place by 1400 BCE. Now, I'll go through them, see what you think. I'll finish with this. First of all, for the Minoans, the word labyrinth simply had the meaning of a sacred temenos or sanctuary, a cult place to worship and encounter the goddess. And we know from archaeology that Minoans often, not always, but often, worshipped in dark underground places. Homer mentions the cave of the god Aletheia at Knossos, near modern Heracleion. Cave worship was one of the ways that the Minoans contacted divinity. There are 19 cave sanctuaries known on Crete, and it seems that these cave sanctuaries were artificially reproduced in the subterranean pillar crypts, the sunken lustral basins, and the narrow passageways of the underground of the palatial centres. And you can see right in the middle of the slide there, and then up again to the right, you can see that area there is a pillar crypt. At the top, it's being excavated. At the bottom, it's after Evans has conserved it, but it's deep in the bowels of Knossos. It's not a light place, it's a dark place, and there are lots of indications that this kind of place was where at least some Minoan worship took place. Now, I spoke earlier about the Minoan awareness and manipulation of light in their buildings, but of course a people so attuned to nuances of light would also be deeply conscious of the uncanny hallucinatory effects of darkness. With the collapse of the Bronze Age world in 1100 BCE, the primary meaning of labyrinth as a sacred sanctuary disappeared, and only the association with dark, complicated places remained. The Iron Age Greeks, from sort of 800 or so on, for whom the idea of worshipping in darkness was completely alien, simply took the Minoan word labyrinth and gave it the new meaning of a dark, imprisoning maze. And such changes of meaning are common changes of meaning in words are common in the history of language. By about 300 BCE, our concept of a labyrinth had become part of Hellenistic Greek vocabulary. So we have a labyrinth. What about the Minotaur? Well, we'll have no difficulty finding a prototype for the Minotaur. There are numerous hybrid and man-bull creatures in Minoan iconography. You can see a few examples on the slide. Confronted with these hybrids and the ubiquitous bull imagery everywhere at Knossos, the later Greeks might well have imagined a bull-headed man monster lurking in subterranean underground rooms and passageways. And surviving memories of the life-threatening Minoan acrobatic practice of bull leaping and of bull sacrifice may have prompted stories about a battle with a bull monster. So now, what about Theseus and Ariadne? In our modern story, Theseus is the hero and Ariadne is the woman scorned, exploited and abandoned. But I have to say, even the later Greeks never quite bought that. As I said, there are other endings, but the one that prevailed was that Ariadne was ultimately married to Dionysus and given divinity by Zeus at Dionysus's request. In other words, via a very indirect route, Ariadne ultimately became the goddess she was all along. Now, you have already heard Homer's story of Daedalus and the wonderful dancing floor that connects him with Ariadne. But we also have a Linear B tablet that emphatically connects him with the Minoan Mycenaean world. You can see part of it at the top of the slide. It comes from Knossos and records a dedication of 19.2 litres of olive oil for the sanctuary of Daedalus. That's the best picture I could get. I've done as well as I can here, but you can see the translation and you can see the copy of the Minoan text over on the right-hand side. So the Minoans and the Mycenaeans certainly knew about Daedalus because they were offering olive oil to a sanctuary of Daedalus. But even more significant, we have several dedications also from Knossos to the mistress of the labyrinth. Second on the slide, you see a very crumbly Linear B tablet. As I say, it's the best picture I could get. It records a dedication of an amphora of honey to the mistress of the labyrinth. A whole amphora just for her was an extraordinary distinction because the first line of the tablet records an offering of the same amount to all the gods together. And if you look carefully, you'll see there's an amphora on both lines, on the top and bottom. The first is the amphora to all the gods, and the second is the amphora just for Ariadne. Now, we don't know the name. Well, I'm calling her Ariadne. Her name is the mistress of the labyrinth. I should have said mistress of the labyrinth. I shouldn't be calling her Ariadne yet. But we don't know the name of this powerful mistress of the labyrinth. But given that Ariadne is a title meaning most holy, it's reasonable to think that the mistress was addressed by that name, which is why I was calling her that name. Regardless of what her name was, she would have been called Ariadne because Ariadne means most holy. Whatever else she was called, she would have been Ariadne. So there we have a dedication of an amphora of honey to the mistress of the labyrinth. Now, I don't have a picture of this, but another tablet from Knossos, number 3 on the slide, records an offering of fine linen cloth to the mistress of the labyrinth. The spidery symbol you see means linen cloth. Now, in my view, see what you think about this, in my view, it's feasible to suppose that over time, when all knowledge of Minoan goddess religion was lost, the woven linen cloth dedicated to Ariadne could have gradually changed through a process of Chinese whispers to become the ball of linen thread that she used to help Theseus escape from the labyrinth. That's why, although I haven't got a picture of that particular Linear B tablet, that dedication of linen cloth strikes me as particularly important because it strikes me that it's very feasible as the origin of the ball of linen thread. And after all, what Ariadne does in Greek myth, that is, she falls madly in love and betrays her family, is what women do. Think of Helen and Paris, think of Jason and Medea. That's what women do in Greek myth. And Ariadne is characterized in that way as well. So now what do we know of Theseus? Well, number 4 on the slide is a tablet from Pylos, that's in the Peloponnese, we'll be visiting Pylos, lists Theseus as an ordinary Mycenaean and as a vassal of the goddess. He was her devoted, worshipful votary, and in this religious role, he was gifted a plot of land and 38 litres of barley seed. So he's not a hero, he is a servant, a worshipful servant on that linear B tablet, number 4 on the slide. And finally, number 5, the god Dionysus, a newly discovered tablet from Hania. And I'll just interrupt myself to say amazing things are turning up in Hania. A newly discovered tablet from Hania records an offering of 2 amphorae of honey for Dionysus. Now you remember that 1 amphora for the mistress of the labyrinth was a splendid dedication, but now 2 for Dionysus. His worship was clearly in the ascendant. The story of Ariadne's rescue and marriage to Dionysus may well indicate that her cult was overtaken by and assimilated to his, that her worship and her cult was absorbed into the cult of Dionysus. It seems that she was a fertility goddess and Dionysus is a fertility god. It would work to assimilate her worship to his, and the Greeks were always more comfortable with male rather than female gods anyway. Now, it's interesting that almost all the elements in our modern Theseus and the Minotaur story are Minoan elements in reverse. The word labyrinth, originally the name for a place of worship, has come to mean a disturbing prison. The powerful goddess Ariadne, with power over life and death, has been demoted to a woman in love. Her devout vassal, Theseus, has been elevated to become a great hero. And finally, the cult of the goddess Ariadne has been assimilated to the ecstatic theasis of the male god Dionysus. One scholar has written, a great number of Minoan traditions and rituals that the Greeks could not understand were doomed to oblivion. But as we've just seen, others were reinterpreted according to the ideas and assumptions of the later Greco-Roman world and transformed into myth. I hope you've enjoyed that bit of detective work, and even if in time some part of the puzzle turns out not to be quite correct, I hope you know a bit more now about the Minoan Mycenaean thought world, about the way myths evolve, and especially about the Homer tour.
Thank you, Heather. That was really fascinating. I've learned so much from what you had to say. And what I think would be really wonderful, Heather, is if you could send through to us a future reading list. I mean, obviously reading Homer, but some of the other scholars that you mentioned, if you could send through a reading list, we could add this to the end of the recorded talk.
I'd be very happy.
And so everyone watching it could then have a further reading list, which I think would be really valuable. But thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk. Now, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Heather?
Or objections to that construction I just made of the story?
I'd just like to add my gratitude for what is the best presentation I've heard in this kind of setting. Very informative, beautiful slides, very detailed, very satisfying presentation, Heather. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
What caused the collapse of all those places roughly at the same time?
It's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? There's the book I mentioned. I will try to give you a quick answer, but the book I mentioned by Eric Klein, 11,000 BCE, the date the world collapsed, or something like that. But I will definitely send you the reference to that. He actually goes through all the possible causes, but his idea is that it was just a perfect storm of all kinds, that there were earthquakes, that there were internal rebellions, that there were external invasions, that there was climate change, that crops were failing, there was starvation, that it was a time of chaos right across the Middle East and Greece. So he sees it as a perfect storm of circumstances.
Do we know the length of that period?
Yes, it was. Well, it was only, the Bronze Age collapse happened at about 1100, and as you remember, I said 900, the Greek world gets going again. So there's only a hiatus of about 200 years. But writing was lost. Writing was lost, and all kinds of, religious culture was lost. And as far as writing was concerned, the Greek alphabet was only kind of developed around 800, 700, 800. So there was quite a period of time from 1100 to 800 or so, 1100 to 700, where there was no writing in Greece.
Thank you, Heather. I enjoyed the talk very much.
Thank you.
Heather, the various places that you showed us in your images, are excavations still ongoing today? They're still trying to find things there and digging things up?
They are. And from one year to the next, there are new things in the places we visit. It's very exciting to do that, and we do go off the beaten track, and we do go to the really exciting excavations, and we speak to people. We sometimes get to speak to archaeologists and so on who can tell us about their on the ground work. So yes, we do.
And then I too add my thanks to a wonderful talk. Could you
Michael.
Hello, Heather. Could you just tell me what your current favourite translation of both the Iliad and the Odyssey is at the moment?
Oh, that's a leading question, isn't it? I still prefer the Lattimore translations. You're asking me because there's been a plethora of new translations, aren't you? And you might be asking me particularly about the new one that's just come out of the Iliad. Wilson?
Emily Wilson, yeah.
Emily Wilson, yes. You've got it?
I have indeed.
Yes.
Depends on what you say
compare it with
about it.
Lattimore and see what you think. Can I just say one thing about Emily Wilson's translation of Odysseus? Lattimore, this is maybe word 10 of the Odyssey, describes Odysseus as polytropos. It's the word polytropos, and it means a man of many turns. That's what it literally means. And in the translation I love, it's translated literally as many turns. And you know who Emily Wilson, you know how she translates it, don't you?
No.
She translates it as complex. Odysseus was a complex man. Odysseus was a man of many turns, of many ways. That kind of gets the difference, I think.
Can you give me the full name of the Lattimore? What's the Christian name?
Yes, it's Richmond, like the suburb Richmond Lattimore, and it's the Iliad and the Odyssey. He translated them both in the 1950s. They were absolutely epoch-making when he translated them. He wasn't a classicist himself, but he had done classics. He knew Greek, he negotiated with classicists, and he was a poet. So they're all very, very fine qualifications. But I must say, at La Trobe, we finally moved away from the Lattimore translation this year because students were finding it too difficult. We went to one that we hoped students would find more accessible. Actually, they didn't particularly, but by a man called Stanley Lombardo. It's a much more punk kind of translation. But many students just went back to Lattimore.
Thank you very much.
What, if any, links are there between the Minoans and the civilization that was on Santorini?
They are Minoans. They are in effect Minoans.
That's what I thought they were. And I mean, they collapsed when Akrotiri and that place erupted.
Yes,
that's what I thought.
1600 when Akrotiri erupted, and that was one of the most enormous volcanic explosions ever in the history of the world, bigger than Krakatoa. They're still finding tephra from that explosion in Russia. So it destroyed the civilization on Santorini. And it also had an effect. It may have been one of the factors ultimately, it's hard to know, one of the factors ultimately in the demise of the Minoan civilization on Crete. the city, we've only got Akrotiri. There's a lot more there on Santorini, but it just hasn't been excavated yet. But it's slightly different, slightly lighter, maybe a little bit more elite, maybe a little bit richer. It's a very wealthy civilization on Akrotiri, but it's essentially Minoan.
But they've found very little in the way of gold or, so I think there's one gold object that's been excavated. It's almost as if they had warning that it was going to erupt, as I understand it.
Well, no, that's absolutely right. They left a little golden ibex, and as if that was left to placate the goddess, to placate the earth. But since we've been there, the archaeologists, they're digging, they're finding, this is in answer to Susanna's question, that the archaeologists at Akrotiri have actually found a Cycladic figure. Those particular figures actually buried with the ibex, in close proximity to the ibex, in that place which was a public building, it seems, at Akrotiri. So they might find more, but that again that's a lot older than the civilization on Akrotiri. So it's as if they've left really precious things to somehow placate the wild earth goddess that was rumbling. And that you'd know too that we've got evidence that they took their beds outside and so on, and at least for a certain period they were sleeping outside, but then they seem to have evacuated. No skeletons have been found, but they may have just simply drowned in the tsunami, because there were enormous, as you would know, enormous tsunamis after the eruption.
So what is the timeline between what's going on in Akrotiri and what's going on in Knossos?
So Knossos is coming to its height in 1700. Knossos is destroyed in 1600. But I would say Akrotiri was probably at a height as well, maybe in parallel at a very similar time. It's a pity that we'll never know what that trajectory might have been, because that whole settlement was wiped out on Santorini. The island changed forever.
And do we know about links, trading links, or, because there was Linear B, I think, found in Santorini, wasn't there?
Yes. And also Linear A, of course. Yes, there were definitely trade connections between, and they're almost within eyesight of each other, Crete and Santorini. But there were definitely trade links, because there's certain indications they were using exactly the same systems of weights and measures, for example. And there are tremendous similarities in their style of drawing and their ritual behaviour, the way they construct their buildings and so on. The way they think, just to give you one tiny example, the way they represent the different ages of a human being. The young ones are bald, and then they have just a you know what I'm saying, just a tuft of hair, until finally as adults they have full heads of hair. So that kind of coding of childhood through to adolescence was the same on Crete as it was on Akrotiri. I think, we have to assume, it makes perfect sense to assume that they were in contact and influencing each other.
I was just going to say, some of that hairstyling is also common to Egyptian civilization, isn't it?
It's a bit different. It's not quite the same. No. There's no doubt, I think, that the Minoans were influenced by the Egyptians, but my goodness, they developed a very distinctive, unique civilization.
Really is a very fascinating culture, and I think this evening Heather has given us such a really intriguing glimpse into Minoan civilization and following in the footsteps of one of the great writers of all time, Homer. So Heather, thank you so much for a really illuminating presentation. It was just wonderful. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and a huge thank you to Heather for a really fascinating presentation. Thank you so much, Heather. It was just wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Susanna.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was fabulous. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.